We're on number 9, right? Yeah, Mozambique. Though we've already poked around much of its borders, it gets its very own fun episode. Mozambique is our first country that's not located primarily on the South African plateau, skirting the eastern escarpments of it. In the north, the Luangwa Valley separates it from the East Africa plateau. This plateau continues north all the way to Ethiopia. Currently, it is being split apart by tectonic forces, creating the East Africa Rift. It's quite dramatic in Malawi, but calms down as it reaches Mozambique, shrinking down to a valley lined by low hills to the sea. South of that lie the Limpopo lowlands. The interior of Mozambique contains that familiar highland Myombo savanna and the lowland Mopane savanna. The Rift Mountains are covered in a forest grassland mosaic, but along the coast is wetter forest, savanna, swamps, and mangroves. This is because, while the interior tends to be semi-arid, the coast is considered humid. Wet season October to March, dry April to September. Most of the country is tropical, but the highlands have a cooler subtropical climate. Mozambique has been inhabited by humans for a couple million years. Really, we'll have to talk more about pre-modern humans sometime. When Homo sapiens emerged somewhere in southern eastern Africa, they diverged into various lineages. Mozambique, due to its location, was a meeting point between these lineages: Southern Africans, Central Africans, and East Africans, giving rise to the Khoisan, Batwa, and the East African Bushmen. The third group will get more airtime in Tanzania, because they still survive, but Mozambique's indigenous folk were sadly drowned out by the overpowering presence of the Bantu. We've done this song and dance before, and we will continue to do so for some time yet. The Bantu migrate into Mozambique probably via both the Zambezi River and the coast, occupying the country by about 2,000 years ago. When Bantu emerged as a distinct people around 4,000 years ago, it was as a farming folk, growing millet, sorghum, and probably rice. Later on, in the first millennium BC, Bantu acquired ironworking, either self-taught or imported from the Mediterranean. Either way, the Bantu were now a formidable culture, and here 3 overgroups of Bantu develop. We've met all 3 before. First, we have the lower Zambezians, inhabiting the lower reaches of that river, and also the highlands northeast. In the Rovuma watershed are the southernmost extension of the southern Lacustrine Bantu, a diverse assemblage that belongs to a larger group of East African Bantu of Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. And third, just south of the Beira estuary, are the southern Bantu. These are our buddies that later evolve into the famous groups of South Africa and Zimbabwe. The coastal Nguni probably occupy the area around Maputo Bay, but north of the Sabi River are the Tsonga, who cover the lowlands all the way to the Drakensberg and Zimbabwe highlands, where Shona dwell. But in the southeast corner of Mozambique, in a series of small hills and lagoons, a small Inyabani people emerge, isolated from the rest. Our friends the lower Zambezians break off into Chewa along the river, while Makua occupy the highlands. In Mozambique, the Lacustrine Bantu break off into a southern clade, occupying the Rovuma and lower Rufiji river valleys. And about 1,000 years ago, Shona and Chewa covert into a new Sena people. The southern Lacustrine Bantu go their separate ways. Those in Mozambique, the Rovuma peoples, and our lagoonal friends split in twain. Along the Inyarima River, the Chopi come into their own, while around Inyambani Bay, a third Tonga people emerge, unrelated to the Tonga of either Zambia or Malawi. Mozambique is cool because the first major outside influence to reach it was not European, but Muslim. Trade has crossed the Indian Ocean probably since the dawn of ocean travel, and the east coast of Africa has been part for at least 2,000 years. By the 11th century, gold and copper from Zimbabwe and Zambia were joining ivory and slaves from Malawi and Tanzania as exports to the old world empires of Eurasia. Mozambique was perfectly positioned for trade into the interior, and Muslim traders founded important posts at Sofala, Quelimane, Inyambani, Angoche, and an island to be called Mozambique. According to tradition, many of these traders were Persians from Shiraz, and eventually created a new nation of mixed Arab, Persian, and Bantu. The Arabs referred to them as Swahili, those of the coasts, Swahili. They called themselves Wangwana, the civilized ones. They wore this proudly, as Muslims brought with them Islam, writing, literature, art, mathematics, architecture, and sailing, enriching the coastal Bantu. Several sultanates emerged along the coast of East Africa, controlling the trade. Kilwa was one of them that in the 13th century established dominance. By the 15th, Kilwa ruled most of the Swahili coast, growing prosperous off the gold and ivory trades. South of Inyambani, the current is too strong, the winds too unpredictable, marking the point where traders dare not venture. Portugal has been a consistent player in this series, and here they get to shine. For centuries, Europe had purchased goods like spices, silk, and perfumes come from the mysterious realms of Asia. But these were only bought at exorbitant rates through middlemen along the Silk Road. Advances in sailing and navigation enabled the Portuguese, positioned at the western edge of Europe, to sail out into the Atlantic. Their goal was the source of these goods, the Indies. Columbus famously sailed west and found the Americas, but Bartolomeu Dias went east and made it to the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. A follow-up voyage by Vasco da Gama in 1498 made it all the way to India. Mission accomplished. Da Gama also stopped along the Swahili coast, whose intercourse the Chewa kingdom of Maravi had joined. The Rovuma Bantu also break off into the lower Makonde and upper Yao, allies and associates of the Swahili. By 1500, Kilwa had fragmented into 5 smaller kingdoms, including Sofala and Mozambique. The Portuguese were all too happy to take advantage of the situation. See, in 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, by which both new colonial powers agreed to divide the world, yes, the world, between themselves. Spain got most of the Americas and Pacific, Portugal, Africa, and Asia. There's a lot more to the story, and other Europeans had thoughts on the matter, let alone the peoples and kingdoms in the lands ostensibly claimed by the Iberians. Portugal had rather less success conquering their hemisphere compared to the Spanish, but Portugal firmly dominated the sea lanes of the east. Portugal, then both by the pen and the sword, began establishing control over the Swahili coast. First, in 1505, forts were built at Kilwa and Sofala, bringing the coast under tentative Portuguese rule, using the local Swahili sheiks. This was followed in 1507 with a fort on the island of Mozambique. I wasn't able to find what the island's name was before, but the Portuguese called it the Ilha de Mozambique, after its ruling sheik Musa ibn Mbiki. English, under the sway of French, realized it as Mozambique. The Portuguese were first drawn by the gold trade of Mutapa and set up posts along the Zambezi, Sena near the confluence with the Shire River, and Tete at the Revoboy. This network of trade posts and ports was organized as the Captaincy of Sofala, a division of the Portuguese state of India, responsible for all its possessions around the Indian Ocean. In 1569, it became the Captaincy of Mozambique and Sofala. Portugal's schemes to secure control over these new conquests was the praxis system, granting holdings to Portuguese conquistadors, a bit like the encomienda system in colonial Spanish America. The holder was entitled to the incomes of farms, mines, and trade. The system didn't work great and attracted little Portuguese settlement, but the praxeiros made much of their money selling captured Africans, and they were sold to the sugar plantations of Brazil. The southern plain has remained rather quiet, Tsonga and Unguni clans playing tug-of-war for land rights. By 1600, the Ronga clan of Tsonga establishes themselves around Delagoa Bay, east of the Lebombo Mountains. Around 1650, Maravi subdues the Makua and threatens the Portuguese position along the coast. Because by the later 17th century, what is called the first phase of the Portuguese Empire began to end, for a number of reasons, like competition with English, French, and Dutch traders, who had learned the sea lanes, and also a prolonged war with the Dutch, who were capturing many Portuguese trading posts in Asia. Even so, Portugal does push up the Zambezi and founds Zubu on the Luangwa River, and subjugates Mutapa in 1694. Thus begins a 20-year struggle with the Kalunga-Rosvi kingdom over the Zimbabwe highlands. But stretched thin, Portugal lost its hold over Oman in Arabia, and the Omani struck back with a vengeance. Saif ibn Sultan of Oman leads a campaign in 1698 that rustles most of the Swahili coast from Portugal, once and for all. Either Oman was unable or unwilling to push all the way down the coast, as Portugal retains its captaincy about south of the Rovuma River, though its control over the hinterlands remains weak. The real money to be made for Europeans was in India and Indonesia, and they don't bother much with Portuguese Africa. With Portugal focusing in Asia and Brazil, Sofala and Mozambique fade into backwaters, while Rosvi wins the struggle for the Zimbabwe highlands. Portugal is spared from further reverses by the decline of Marawi and its withdrawal from Akua territory, and the slave trade continued to buoy the colony. In 1752, it's separated from the state of India as the Captaincy General of Sofala, Mozambique, and the rivers of Sena. The Tsonga victory over the Unguni is repaid in 1824 during the Umfitane. King Zwide II of the Ndwandwe, one of several Unguni tribes, was defeated by King Shaka of the Zulu. The Zulu conquered the Unguni south of the Pongola River, while north, the Ngwane found their own kingdom, the future Eswatini. But two exiled Ndwandwe chiefs and their people escape. The Ungoni under Zwangendaba we've met before. The second are the Gaza under Soshangane. Soshangane settles the Limpopo River, conquering the native Tsonga, Chopi, and Tonga. Here, Nguni, Tsonga, and even Shona mingle to become a new Gaza kingdom south of the Save River. Moreover, Yao began their push towards Lake Malawi in 1830, taking advantage of the slave trade. 1835, Ungoni conquered the western lands of the weak Marawi kingdom and Upper Rovuma, and now Portugal found its colony surrounded by aggressive and energetic neighbors north, south, and west. Luckily, with the 1825 loss of Brazil, the second phase of empire ended, and Portugal returned attention to its remaining holdings in Africa. 1836, in a bid to associate its colony more closely to the mother country, Portugal reorganized the Captaincy General of Sofala, Mozambique, and the rivers of Sena into the province of Mozambique, the island capital, now the name of the whole colony. Portugal was feeling the crunch of losing its largest and wealthiest colony in South America, and like a mother forlorn over her oldest moving out, clung evermore to her remaining children. Portugal tried to wrangle Mozambique under control. 1848 gave respite with the death of Zwangendaba and the fragmentation of his realm. Portuguese presence in Delagoa Bay had been meager, but the introduction of the Gaza Empire, the Boers in the Veldt, and the British creeping up the Cape Colony convinced them to found Fort Lourenço Marques in 1850. 1856, Soshangane dies, and his sons fight over the succession. The Portuguese back his son Mzila, who wins in 1861 and becomes a protectorate of the Portuguese, securing their southern flank. 1868, the Boer South African Republic, wishing to bypass British ports, lusts after the perfect outlet to the sea, Delagoa Bay. Portugal, the Boers, and Kangwane all have their eye on it. The next year, unable to challenge Portugal, Boer President Martinus Pretorius acquiesces to Portuguese claims east of the Lebombo Mountains. That same year, with slavery falling out of fashion in the Western world, in favor of ideas of human rights and dignity, Portugal finally abolished slavery in its colonies, effectively ending the Atlantic slave trade after nearly 400 years. But of course, slavery persisted amongst the Muslims and Africans, and European explorers and missionaries began finding a crusade to end the scourge of slavery once and for all. This was one of several reasons Europe gained an interest in the exploration and colonization of Africa. Portugal had been in Africa for centuries at this point, so when other Europeans started poking around the Congo and Zambezi rivers, Portugal appealed to hold a conference so their zones weren't intruded by the larger, more modern industrial powers of Britain, France, and Germany. Already, in 1875, Portugal and Britain agreed to the boundary of their zones in southern Africa. down the Maputo River until it meets the Pongola, thence along a line to the coast. This happened just in time for the British to move into the Transvaal and Zululand. 1879, the Portuguese moved to the Roe River, probing deeper into Zambezia. 1881, with Transvaal and Swaziland in the British sphere, the border was formally set. From the Maputo River, it ran north along the eastern base of the Lubombo Mountains. Then, about two-thirds of the way north, it switches to the western base, traveling along a series of lines that essentially skirt the very edge of the Lowveld until it reaches the Limpopo's confluence with the Luvuvu, where the Limpopo forms the rest of the border. The south was secure, but Portugal's ambitions were focused on connecting Angola and Mozambique through the interior. 1882, they moved into the lower Shire, now touching elbows with Scottish missionaries in Blantyre. 1885, and the Berlin Conference is called, giving Portugal a chance to secure support for its aims. No disrespect to Portugal, but by the late 19th century she was no longer the great power she was in the 16th. Britain, France, and Germany obtained extensive zones of Africa, while Portugal was effectively stuck with what it already had. But no matter. Portugal occupied Sena and Mokua lands and made deals with France and Germany to colonize Zambezia. Part of this meant in 1886 Portugal and Germany agreed on the Rovuma River to its confluence with the Msinge River, then due west to Lake Malawi as the boundary between Mozambique and the claims of the new German East Africa Company. The Gwangara, Ngoni, and Yao, though, still stood in the way. It was looking good. Alexandre G. Sherpa Pito traveling up the river, making deals with local chiefs to make their claims legitimate, but perfidious Albion was up to its old tricks again. The British government didn't have much interest in Africa north of the Limpopo, but its agents did. We've seen them before. Henry Hamilton Johnston wanted Lake Malawi for the Empire, and Cecil Rhodes' British South Africa Company was granted rights to colonize essentially the entire zone Portugal was after. Eventually, the British Prime Minister got on board too, and advised the Portuguese to withdraw. The Portuguese government thought better of antagonizing Britain during her imperial century, and agreed to the ultimatum. The Portuguese Prime Minister resigned, and riots erupted in Portugal for this affront to the nation's honor, but ultimately Britain got her way. Portugal withdrew, and in 1891 a treaty was signed establishing the borders. From the Luvuvu-Limpopo point, the border continues along a straight line to the Save River, a little ways down, then along some ridges to the eastern highlands, north to the Luenya River, then along the edge of the Zimbabwe highlands, partially with the Mozoi River, until it goes north to divide the Cis-Zambezi plain roughly in half. The border goes north about the longitude of Zumbo. Portugal had been there for near 200 years, so it was considered proper Portuguese claims. But no further. Then we go north along the Luangwa River to just before it meets the Lunsemva River, and goes northeast along a not-so-straight line to the watershed between Lake Malawi and the rest of the Zambezi. Due to the presence of those Nyasaland missions, the border travels along this watershed to about the 17th south latitude, due east to the Shire River, up to the Roe River, then along it to some lines east of Lake Chilwa before going northwest to Lake Malawi. The inclusion of Zumbo and the denial of the Shire country both created Mozambique's odd little thumb in the west. So now, finally, Mozambique's borders are set. The treaty also gave Britain a concession in the town of Chinji at the mouth of the Zambezi. The river was ocean navigable and therefore an international waterway. Britain needed a port. Exactly why I wasn't able to find, maybe to soothe the nation's bruised pride after being bullied by Britain. Mozambique is officially renamed the State of East Africa. 2 years later it goes back to the province of Mozambique, though. Germany also bullied little Portugal into handing over a small sliver of land around the mouth of the Rovuma, the Kionga Triangle, in 1894. Meanwhile, some cleaning house was in order with the stubborn native kingdoms. 1895 and rebellious King Gungunyana of Gaza and the Yao are crushed. 1896, the Maseko Ngoni are divided between victorious Portuguese and British. 1898, the capital is moved from Mozambique itself to the other end at Lourenço Marques, and only in 1907 does Germany defeat the Gwangara Ngoni, securing full Portuguese control over Mozambique. With the lackluster results of the project, Portugal follows Britain's lead and creates charter companies to develop Mozambique. Using forced African labor, indentured, not enslaved, they build infrastructure. There were problems at home, though. Geopolitical bullying really damaged the government's reputation, along with 2 bankruptcies in 10 years. In 1908, King Carlos is assassinated, and in 1910, the monarchy is overthrown. The new Portuguese Republic, however, didn't have it much better. Political polarization and violence were common. Originally wanting to remain neutral, Portugal joined the Entente in 1916 during the First World War after Germany prodded their border. Germans invaded Mozambique, and natives in the colony rose up against oppressive policies. Portugal had difficulties organizing resistance, but Britain and even some Ngoni warriors lent a hand. For their trouble, Portugal got the Kionga Triangle back, and Britain returned Chinji in 1923, preferring the new railroad to Beira. Things only got worse, with coups, assassinations, a brief civil war, until finally the Republic fell to a military dictatorship in 1926. At this point, the new leadership, I guess, wanted to focus on Portugal, so downgraded Mozambique back to colony. In 1933, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar's Estado Novo regime came to power. More on that during Portugal's episode. Salazar centralized Mozambique, taking away administrative rights from the companies. At the end of World War II, the global mood was anti-colonialism, with the recognition of the rights to self-government of the many peoples of Asia and Africa. Well, Portugal for a long time wished to contextualize its empire not as colonies in foreign lands, but as components of Portuguese culture, heritage, and the nation itself. In 1951, Mozambique went back to being a province, an overseas but integral part of the Portuguese nation. Portugal, to the ideology of the Estado Novo, was a multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-continental, but single Portuguese Catholic nation. Granting independence would be tantamount to national dismemberment. Many in the international community and many Mozambique Africans disagreed, as a Portuguese elite ruled over the province. The loss of Portuguese India was bad enough, but after American advice to abandon its overseas provinces and Soviets supporting communist rebels, Portugal was left fighting the Colonial War starting in 1961. It was fought all over Portuguese Africa, but in Mozambique it was against the Marxist-Leninist Mozambique Liberation Front, Frelimo. Despite backing from the Soviets and American hostility, Portugal actually managed to defeat most of the guerrillas in Mozambique by the 1970s, and even aided Rhodesia in the Bush War. Mozambique was designated a state in 1972 to increase legitimacy. But, weary from years of war, debts mounting up, young men refusing to fight overseas, and frustration with the authoritarian Estado Novo regime led to the Carnation Revolution in 1974. Portugal democratized, and to the surprise of NATO, lost the stomach for empire. Portugal swiftly granted independence to its overseas provinces. In 1975, Mozambique was officially granted independence from Portugal after nearly 500 years. Frelimo was now in charge, and they proclaimed the People's Republic of Mozambique, República Popular de Moçambique, a one-party socialist state like its patron the USSR. Lourenço Marques was renamed Maputo, after the river. Most Portuguese soon left the country, but despite this, Mozambique kept using the Portuguese language, the simplest choice in such a multi-ethnic country. But the ensuing communist cultural revolution alienated many Mozambicans. Under patronage from both Rhodesia and South Africa, these anti-communists gathered as the Mozambican National Resistance, Renamo. The Mozambican Civil War erupted in 1977, ravaging the country for the next 15 years. Over 1 million people perished by violence, disease, and famine, many more displaced. Only when the Soviet Union's and apartheid South Africa's days were numbered did fighting stop. Mozambique became the multi-party liberal República de Moçambique in 1990. In 1992, the war formally ended. Renamo got what they wanted, but Frelimo ultimately won the 1994 elections, now rebranded as Democratic Socialists. War had ruined Mozambique for 30 years at this point, but the country has taken steps to recover. Its politics are fairly stable and free, and Mozambique even joined the Commonwealth of Nations, an organization normally reserved for former British colonies. The economy has grown, but the country remains very poor and mostly focused on agriculture and fishing. Frelimo remains popular and in power, and allegations of foul play caused Renamo insurgents to heat things up again in the 2010s. Islamic insurgents have since 2017 been active over the majority Christian government's inability to address their grievances. Mozambique still has a long way to go to emerge from the shadow of the violence it has endured. Alright, woohoo! We actually finished with Southern Africa. But there remains an island to cover, Madagascar. This is going to be exciting because Madagascar really is like no other place on Earth. I'll see you next time.